But I support this bill in the House today.
I call Jacinda Ardern.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. It's my pleasure to speak to it's more of the substance of the bill than necessarily what perhaps the last speaker may have referred to. Our concern with this bill has been that for some time there has been an erosion of the Families Commission, that it has moved away from its original purpose, that it is no longer advocating for the best interests of families in New Zealand. And we believe that that is being furthered today through this legislation. Now, not only do we have organisational change, so fewer commissioners, some consolidation of the way that the structure works, it also feels to us that there is a narrowing of the advocacy role of the Families Commission, as if it could have been narrowed any further, Mr. Speaker. The best example I can think of is that recently the Families Commission chose not to put down an advocacy position around the extension of paid parental leave, despite research and evidence from the World Health Organisation advocating an extension, despite the Families Commission in the past having done research itself and advocating an extension. So the only thing that you could therefore point to was that there was some kind of politicisation, that because the government didn't wish to extend paid parental leave to the extent that the Labour Party was promoting through Sue Moroney's bill, that it was a face-saving mechanism not to have a commission like the Families Commission come out and agree with that. That's the only interpretation one can take, given that there was such a turnaround in their position. So it has become our view that, given all of that, that the Families Commission should be abolished entirely, and that we should start instead investing greater effort into the Children's Commission, particularly given that they have demonstrated a greater advocacy role, that they have taken up what we think is the true issues facing children of their own volition, as they should, as an independent entity. And in fact, we would like to give them greater independence in the same way that the Parliamentary Commissioner for the Environment does, for instance. And the New Zealand First member, I think, rightly pointed out that we do have a wealth of information now out there about the kinds of things that we need to be doing on behalf of children and their families. We've had the Child Poverty, the Children's Commissioner's Expert Advisory Group on Child Poverty Solutions on Child Poverty. We've had the Māori Affairs Select Committee, and we had the Health Select Committee produce a very, very good report on the importance of the first 100 days and what should be done to improve the lot of children there. So we have a range of evidence, and yet, interestingly, the Families Commission, which presumably would have been involved, you would have thought, in at least advocating or realising some of the issues that are being raised in these areas, had very little to say on it. In fact, when you ask them via Select Committee about their main focus in the future, they talk about things like adolescence, alcoholism. Alcoholism, yes, very, very important, but there are a range of other issues that feel very, very untouched by the Families Commission. So that is what we would do differently. Not only would we reallocate that investment to the Children's Commission, we would also establish a Children's Minister. We would establish child impact assessments so that every piece of legislation coming through Parliament that would have an effect in some way on children would have an impact assessment included. So, for instance, any bills that suggested changes in gambling laws would rightly so include an assessment of the impact on children and families. Alcohol law changes, exactly the same, a really practical measure that we can take to improve the lot of children and families. We would also introduce a Child Poverty Eradication and Reduction Act. Essentially, it would be an action plan for children and families. It would set out how we would measure child poverty, what targets we would set to reduce it. It would establish a board across health, education, social development, and create a set of objectives on how we would make sure that we would reduce the effects of poverty across all of those areas, housing as well. For instance, if you wanted to reduce rheumatic fever rates, you wouldn't just put that with health, you would put it with housing. We would make it an across-the-board gathering of chief executives, and we would set genuine targets to start reducing the effects of poverty on children and their families. Those are some of the practical initiatives that we want to take to put children at the heart of everything we do. We don't believe that the Families Commission are a part of that anymore. They've simply stepped too far away from their mantra. Now, one concern I do want to raise, though, given that the government has decided to retain the Families Commission, one issue I want to raise is this. They will establish now a social policy and evaluation unit. It's got a predetermined annual budget of $3.5 million. Not too much specific information about what they will be confined to researching. There are a great number of contracts out there in this space working with families who might, for instance, tap into the evaluation resource that will exist here. But we're not quite clear on who will be benefiting from the existence of this unit. One thing we do know is this, and Alfred Naro talked about this. We now know that the government wants the Growing Up in New Zealand longitudinal study to be connected to the Families Commission. Now, Alfred Naro claimed that what the longitudinal study needed was a champion. Well, I have to disagree. The longitudinal study was doing very well, thank you very much, without having to have a 40% funding cut, as I understand, attached to what Alfred Naro then dresses up as needing better advocacy. The advocacy they needed was to be able to maintain their ability to continue that very, very important study without having a government come in and start adjusting whether or not they had the money to survive and continue. That's the kind of advocacy they needed. Instead, however, we've seen carte blanche shifting of that report. And for what reason? Why is that occurring? The University of Auckland was a perfectly good home for the longitudinal study, as was Otago the last time we did something similar. MSD was funding the longitudinal study. There was nothing that suggested anything was going wrong. We had some very good interim reports, some vital information, the kind that this unit is now being established to produce because apparently we don't have it. We do. We have very good information. Why the change? If some member on that side of the House can tell me why we needed this change, I'd be very interested to hear, because it strikes me that it's nothing more than political. And also, could some member perhaps rationalise the funding cut to that study? Anyone wish to give us a reason why what this bill presumes to advocate, which is greater research and evaluation, a better evidence base, providing better information for us so that we can benefit families? What report did that better than the longitudinal study of Growing Up in New Zealand? It's pretty hard to find anything that was going to do a better job at that than that report, and yet this unit's getting a separate budget allocation, and the Growing Up in New Zealand report has seen a change for the worst in terms of their funding. So if any member would like to explain that to me, I would be greatly enlightened. I suspect it's got something to do with the Prime Minister's Chief Science Advisor coming in and playing a role in some regard and deciding things needed to be done differently. A little transparency would be very, very useful. But overall, Mr. Speaker, that is not the only contradiction in this bill, all of which point to the fact in our minds that this organisation is now highly politicised, and we've seen good examples of that lately. It's time for it to go. The role that it plays can be played better by the Children's Commission. That is why Labor opposes this bill.
I call Mike Sabin.
Thank you, Sue. A short contribution to cap off what other members have been saying. I want to acknowledge the member, Dr. Rajan Prasad, for his previous role and actually his thoughtful contribution on the committee.